I'm very flattered to keep being invited by Faz. So I get to come to a city with 38 degrees centigrade. It's a lot colder in Hamburg. So I'm not going to. I changed the title slightly, and I call it Nation and State versus Europe. And we go back to Henry Kissinger. We always have to start with Henry Kissinger, who famously asked back in '73, if I want to call Europe, what phone number does it have? And that question I posed a few years ago to Catherine Ashton, the foreign minister, so to speak, of Europe, and asked her, look, doesn't Europe have a phone number now? She says, yes, it is my number. When you call my number, you get a computer, and the computer says, for Germany, press 1, for France, press 2, for Britain, press 3. Too bad we won't have funny people like that in the European Commission anymore. So what is this Europe, this EU? It's not a new country. It's not the United States of Europe. And as Catherine Ashton meant to say, Berlin and Madrid and Paris and so on are more important than Brussels. So the question is, what kind of animal is this European Union? And to cut through the confusion, I want to be, forgive me for being a bit academic right now, I want to make a distinction. And the German language only has a nice play of words that doesn't exist in English and probably not in Spanish. And they make a difference between Nationalstaat and Staatsnation. Now, Nationalstaat, as you can hear, translates easily into nation state, which designates the identity between an ethnic, cultural, linguistic community and the political entity we know known as a state. Now, the other word, important as it is, Staatsnation doesn't translate into English. It is the opposite of the nation state that has been populating Europe since around 1500, 500 years or so. This Staatsnation is not based on blood, on culture, on language, but on will. So we, the people, want to live in a common house, no matter what our faith, race, or language. Now, the European Union certainly is not a nation state like Spain or Germany or France. But neither is it this willed nation that the Germans call Staatsnation, as we shall soon see. What is this willed nation? Well, the best examples we have is Switzerland and the United States. Now, Switzerland, as you all know, consists of 4 or even 5 ethnic communities coming together under, speaking different languages, by the way, coming together on a single political roof in the 14th century. And it has a founding myth, which is very important, and that is the so-called Rütli Oath, by which the various cantons came together into a common state, and the oath, the famous mythical oath, is rendered in a famous drama about the Swiss national hero, William Tell. It goes like this: we want to be a single people of brethren, never to part in danger nor distress. We want to be free as our fathers were, and rather die than live in slavery. So a few centuries later, this pledge would be echoed in the most famous slogan of the American Revolution: give me liberty or give me death, Patrick Henry. So both Switzerland and the United States were founded by an act of will. They did not arise from primordial national communities. They are nourished by a sense of common history, a sense of common destiny, And so, like the Swiss, the Americans are a willed nation. Now, the US originally, what does that mean? Let me show you how the United States developed. Originally, the United States started out as an Anglo-Saxon Protestant republic, peopled by Britons and based on the mother country's laws and institutions, a faithful carbon copy. It was a carbon copy of Britain, only of course without a king and nobility. Yet it soon turned into a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, rooted in hallowed documents like the Declaration of Independence, like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Gettysburg Address, whatever. But the point is, anybody, whatever your belief or bloodline, can sign onto them and become an American. So an early French observer, Hector Saint John de Crèvecoeur, noticed this strange mixture of blood: English, Scots, Irish, French, Dutch, Germans. So who, he asks, is an American? He writes, he, quote, he has left behind all his ancient prejudices and manners and receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys. The American, Crèvecoeur writes, is a new man who acts on new principles. So Americans, like the Swiss, have formed this willed nation, not a nation state in the sense of France or Poland. The difference between these two types, now we get to the European Union, after this long academic introduction. You know, academics always make distinctions. The difference between these two types dramatizes the stubborn problem of the European Union. It is neither one nor the other, but suspended somewhere in between. Now, the EU did not, like the Swiss or the Americans, spring from a single act of will. It is a work in progress, has been for the last 60 years. It consists of many nations with sovereignty lodged in the various capitals. Each nation has its own history, its own identity, its own language. They do not claim a common identity. And the sum of the parts is larger than the whole, still is. There is no European people, or demos, to fall back on the ancient Greek. Now, my old teacher at Harvard, the political scientists among you will know the name, as he put it, Europe, in spite of its impressive record of functional integration, still remains a collection of largely self-encased nation states. He continues, if the hostilities entailed by separate paths have appeared to have evaporated, Europe's separate paths have not. Now, please note that Hoffman wrote this 40 years ago. And yet the diagnosis, I think, still stands. Even though, of course, since then, European integration has progressed by leaps and bounds, expanding, as you know, from then 10 members to 28, and not only expanding, but deepening at the same pace in terms of integration, and impressively so. So how, if given this reminder of 40 years ago, how shall this animal that we are talking about turn into a kind of willed nation like the US or Switzerland? They are, to remember, 28 and maybe soon 27 separate histories and cultures. The focus of loyalty is not on Brussels, but on Berlin and Paris and Warsaw and Madrid. The centers of power are the capitals. And if Europe, here's a funny thing, if Euroland, this Europe, has a common language, it is English. Funny. English usually with an American accent. And the same goes, well, it's interesting, you know, look, here we are sitting in Spain, what are we doing? We're talking English. We're not talking German, or we're not talking Spanish, or we're not talking European. And the same, as on a lighter note, the same goes for mass culture. So ironically, what unites us is pop culture made in USA. So we listen and dance to American music, we wear jeans, t-shirts, baseball caps, we watch American movies and series, and we wolf down McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken. Now, that's mass culture. And political debate, a more significant, you know, a more profound thing. Political debate unfolds at home in our own countries, not in the European Parliament, nor in the European-wide media. We don't have European media. So basically, Europeans read and watch their own media, their own papers, their own, etc., or they subscribe to Netflix and the Financial Times. So given that, what I've just described, how would this Europe grow into a real union that rests on a common will and a common destiny? Now, Europe once did have a common sense of history, and that emerged from the horrors of World War II. And it translated into the pledge, never again. Never again war, never what we did in the last 500 years, ever since the French began to fight against the Spanish Habsburg, or even earlier, the French fought forever against the Brits, or English then. Now, but that memory of this never again memory, I think, has been depleted because the children and grandchildren of Adenauer and Jean Monnet no longer remember the cataclysm of World War II. And so for them, peace is not a gift, but a given. Something that has been discounted because it's been around for such a long time and will be. So if you remember, go way back, say, so the late 40s or early 50s, the young went off to the Franco-German border to break down the barriers, that marked the borders, in order to symbolize the transcendence of the nation state. And until very recently, we took Schengen land for granted, passport-free travel from Portugal to Poland. Now passport checks are informally, subtly back in response to the flow of refugees and migrants from the Middle East and North Africa. Just the other day, I flew into Florence, and then these two big policemen said, "Can you show me an ID?" I said, "What do you mean ID? This is Schengen land." "No, we'd still do it." "Do you do it?" The Germans do it too. Yes, true. And that is an interesting change in the basic atmosphere. But apart from these anecdotes, to make a basic point, we still look to, Mrs. Merkel and Monsieur Macron, and to our national parliaments, not to Jean-Claude Juncker, the EU president, or to Strasbourg, the European Parliament. I bet you none of us here can tell us what the European Parliament debated last week. No, it's not a joke, but I mean, I'm trying to make that point because you guys when you think about politics, you think about Madrid. I think about Berlin, and London, and Paris, and so on. So put it in larger terms, and this is one core of my argument, which I'm sure we can debate intensively, or we should. So the European project, the example of Schengenland, shows the European project is bouncing up against its limits. And so, of course, the most dramatic blow, of course, is Brexit, turning seemingly endless expansion from 6 to 28 into secession. But we'll talk about Brexit, I'm sure. The second point is this: the endless crisis over the euro warns that we have gone one bridge too far on the road to, as the Treaty of Lisbon has it, ever closer union. By placing nations into a single monetary straitjacket that doesn't fit each and all. You know, to put it in blunt terms, the euro is too cheap for the Germans and it's too expensive for the Italians. And third, the de facto suspension of Schengen land suggests that in the crunch, nations will follow not the demands of community, but sovereignty. Now, back to conceptual terms. The EU's founding documents, beginning with the Treaty on the Coal and Steel Community, 52, what's the difference between those and the Declaration of Independence or the Swiss Rütli Pledge? They lack emotional punch. Or the mythological origin. You know, if you look at the Declaration of Independence with its self-evident truths and the right and duty to throw off the yoke of absolute despotism and tyranny, that's emotional punch. You don't find that in the Treaty of the Coal and Steel Community, nor in the Treaty of Lisbon. So the Europe's founding documents don't embody the sacral nature, you know, of what I just mentioned, like the Swiss pledge. Now we get to the conceptual point, or theoretical point. The operative faith, or ideology, if you wish, of Europe was functionalism. Very briefly, what does functionalism mean? And that's what the Monnets and the Gasperets, etc., you know, had in mind. Functionalism means if you integrate A, you must soon integrate B, C, D. So, coal and steel, then you have a common market, and then you have, in the end, the euro. Once you start with it, you have to go on. And this reflected the faith in administrative inevitability. You might call it integration on the sly. It was not a lofty act of will underwritten by popular affirmation, as was the US Constitution. And as it deepened, the functionalist approach from coal to currency was destined to creep ever closer to the core of national sovereignty and sharpen the contradictions, as Karl Marx would have it. Take an image. European integration is like going mountain climbing. In the beginning, it's very easy. You're in the foothills. You can go along on a reasonably easy incline, and you keep going and you keep going. But suddenly, you reach the Alps, so to speak, the Eiger north face, and then this is where sovereignty is. This is where the going then gets very, very tough. So the other way of looking at it is the other mainstays of the nation state, such as obligation and identity, did not grow at the same pace as EU institutions, all the way to a foreign minister and a president like Juncker and so on and so on. And now, so the point is, no demos. It didn't come with the rise of a European people or nation, and therefore European-wide political participation. And now we get to the point which is very much au courant, up to date, and that's, I think, why we got the populist revolt that arose not last year, but as early as 2005. You may remember, in 2005, the French and the Dutch voted in a referendum no to the European Constitution. As a result, the Constitution was shelved. We wrote the Treaty of Lisbon, the core of which is shifting power back to the individual states. So we got tired as we moved to the Eiger North face. Now and now I think every European state now, every member state has an anti-European party. Sometimes in the parliament, sometimes still outside. And I think that the populist revolt on the right and the left populism, by the way, is never just right-wing, it's both left and right. If you think about Podemos or Die Linke in Germany, the messages are often very similar about protectionism, state intervention, keep out foreign goods and foreign people and so on. So I think that handwriting stays on the wall, though, and we should discuss this, I think the good news is that the populist wave has crested, has been broken. Now, the central problem, it seems, stems from a Europe as an elite and bureaucratic project that collides with the demands of democratic mass participation. Such an unemotional kind of bloodless venture is not powerful enough to generate a pluribus unum as the US has it, especially since the various elites are also in conflict with each other over the purpose and direction of the European Union. Now, Brexit is an obvious case in point. The verdict was secession, no matter what the costs. No matter what the costs. I mean, we see how the costs are rising for Britain, and we could see it then. We said, we want out. We want to protect our own borders, blah, blah. Then you go east, there's Poland and Hungary, where populist and kind of Europe-critical parties are actually in power. Now, these countries love the EU subsidies, but they hate giving up more sovereignty. Then there's Club Med, the countries of the southern tier, which rail against the German diktat on fiscal discipline and painful reforms to improve competitiveness. Berlin, on the other hand, professes its love of Europe more strongly than anybody else, but it does not like new integrationist projects that would dilute fiscal and monetary discipline and increase Germany's liability for the debts of the rest. So what's the moral of this tale so far? I think it's this. The nation state has proven the sturdiest political institution of the last 500 years. And this kind of longevity against empire and secession and so on obviously reflects functionality. So willed nations like Switzerland and the US remain the exceptions, while Europe is far from becoming one because its members are evidently unwilling to give up their ancient powers lodged in national sovereignty. Remember history, which whispers, look, nations are not built by bureaucratic compromise. And that's another very, very important historical lesson, but by blood and iron. Funny thing is that we think that Spain is the perfect nation state. It isn't, but it was unified by force, by Ferdinand and Isabella. Britain, we think, is a classic nation state, but it became Britain only in interminable internal war until it finally settled down. You think the United States is such a wonderful example of national unity? Well, it almost broke apart in the Civil War. And America was really unified only by the Civil War, which cost about 600,000 lives, more than the US lost in all its other wars. Prussia, Germany, well, it was unified by blood and iron, as Bismarck said in the wars of in 1871. Italy was created by force, and you all remember the famous line by Garibaldi, who said, we've made Italy now we have to make Italians, which suggested that, nations are made by war. And obviously you cannot make the European nation by war, right? But history says, in the end, it took force to unify countries at which we now look at perfect examples of the nation state, the national ethnic community. France was made by the French kings who conquered bit by bit after bit, all the way from the Ile-de-France down to the Mediterranean. So, but that, by the way, Japan, we think Japan is a perfect nation state? Wrong. It was unified in the 19th century again by centralized force. So, enough with the history, but it's worth remembering. So what is the future as I come to my conclusion? What is the future of the European Union? And I have two pieces of good news. First one is very, 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 up to date. As I said, mentioned briefly, the anti-European populist revolt seems to have broken. As you know, in France, Le Pen was beaten back big time, by Macron. In Holland, Geert Wilders was stopped, did not get into government. In Germany, the anti-European AfD, which stands for Alternative for Deutschland, last year scored double digit in the polls. I mean, in the opinion polls. Now they're down to single digit. In Britain, the UKIP dropped from 4 million votes to 600,000. And the outcome we'll discuss this, the outcome of the British election tells us that maybe Britain is having second thoughts about hard Brexit. So that's good news for Europe. The second piece of good news is the enduring vitality of the EU. No matter what I said in a kind of conceptual way before. Because as I argued, the EU is not a nation state, not with its separate cultures and languages and identities, nor is it a willed nation like Switzerland and America. So what is it? And the best answer I could come up with is a biological metaphor. So let's liken Europe to, get ready, to a coral reef. What's a coral reef? It's an organism that obeys no design, but it lives and spreads. It's built by a myriad microscopic animals. It doesn't have a plan, doesn't have a president, it doesn't have a telos, the Greek word for a kind of foreordained identity. Some parts, by the way, of any coral reef break off, but others grow anew. And so to complete this analogy with the EU, unless hammered by an outside force, coral reefs are virtually indestructible. Brexit or not, it's a safe bet that this European reef will endure, just like a real coral reef. So, but I still want to end after the two bits of good news. I want to add with a tricky question. I want to end with a tricky question to make my point about the difficulty of giving up sovereignty. Now we are now in Madrid, the city of Real Madrid, right? One of the world's great football teams, or perhaps the greatest football team. Now I want to ask you this question. What do you think will happen first? A European army or a European football team? Thank you. Gracias.